Well, hello. This is a special edition of AAMI News and Conversation. I'm Brian, and we're here at day 2 at AAMI Exchange 2023, Long Beach, California. I'm here today with one of our new fellows for 2023, Richard Bancroft. Richard, can you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Brian. My name is Richard Bancroft. I'm the Science and Technical Director at STERIS. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm based in the UK. Very pleased to be physically here in beautiful California.
No, absolutely. Now, Richard's been in the standards world for, I think, 3+ decades.
Mm-hmm.
So you wear a lot of AAMI hats. I'm actually going to reference my notes here to talk about it. You're the chairman of the ISO Technical Committee 198, that's sterilization of healthcare products.
Mm-hmm.
You've been a member of AAMI's Committee on Standards Strategy. You've been a past recipient of AAMI's Standards Developer Award, and you're a former member of our Standards Board. I actually didn't know that one. Obviously, that's a lot of standards hats.
Yeah.
And some of the folks who might be here at AAMI Exchange may just think of standards as that thing that they have to adhere to in the background. They might not know the process behind it. They may even be grumbling about it every day.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to kind of dive into the importance of this work, but also how people might want to get involved and how they can get involved.
Okay.
But let's start at the international level. What is ISO?
Okay. So ISO is the International Standards Organization based in Geneva, but they are, of course, global. And the purposes of standards, whether they're developed at ISO level or at other levels, they are consensus developed. So we have a bunch of experts who can draft these things. But the important thing is they give us typically technical specifications or a technical way forward for how to do something, whether it's a product or a service. Those standards are incredibly useful because if you have like an auditor auditing a manufacturer or a sterile service department, they will at least have a very prescriptive way of how to go about what they're doing.
I want to be clear for the folks who might be listening. This isn't basically government or major companies telling everybody else what to do,
Absolutely
right? It's
not.
a collaborative.
And that's why I used the word very deliberately, consensus developed, because standards are developed by a whole bunch of different stakeholders. People who have something to add to the process, of course, but whether these are technical people, and that's basically my background, or whether they are regulators or whether they're end users. All of these people are represented at some level in the development of standards, and that's why standards are so powerful. From a legal perspective, standards are typically voluntary, so conformity to a standard is not required typically by law, but they often give a pathway in order to help comply with the law. So standards are recognized by regulators in that capacity.
Oh, I see. And so why is it important to then have international standards as opposed to just on a national level?
Okay, so you can look at this from both directions, both from the international level or from the national level. There are differences in practices in different parts of the world, so that's where national work comes in. But talking about the international level, there is typically an agreement of the best way of doing something, and why should that vary around the world? So in spite of what I just said about national standards, where practices may be different for good reason, and that's where national standards have a place, typically we try to keep standards as international as possible, which means we have a single way of doing something as opposed to 20 or 30 different ways of doing something, which really doesn't help any of us involved in those processes.
Right. I can imagine, it might be difficult for a company trying to introduce a product into multiple countries to prove that they are in compliance with regulatory requirements in each and every one of those individual countries.
Absolutely. So standards are very, very powerful. I mean, there are literally thousands of standards across all industries, and they all typically serve the same purpose, which is to provide a uniform and standard method or way of doing something.
So let's go behind the scenes. What are these standards meetings actually like? I mean, you've been doing it for a while. You must enjoy them.
I do, and it's actually quite addictive, which is why I'm still doing it 30 plus years later. But when I first started, like anybody else, there's a level of trepidation. You don't really understand how it all works. You don't understand the processes that are going to take place. You don't understand necessarily who this person is across the table that you're debating or even arguing with. But depending on the level and the setting, they're typically from 15 people up to probably more than 100 people. Some of the AAMI meetings are more than 100 people, so you have a microphone in order to help yourself be heard in these big rooms. But that's probably more the exception. The majority of what we do is probably 15 to 30 people sitting in a room. And, we have very prescriptive ways of going forward. We don't just sit there and say, right, how do we start this conversation? We typically have an early draft that somebody has written, and then we have comments that are provided, and those comments have come from all stakeholders, and then we decide how to accept or even reject those comments or accept them with modifications. So I think there's a good point here. We don't quite like the way it's written, but there's a good point and we need to incorporate that. So we're typically not doing wordsmithing during a meeting. That's not good use of 20 people's time all at the same time.
So just falling asleep.
Absolutely, absolutely. But no, we try to make the face-to-face meetings that we have as useful as possible by having the top-level debates as to the direction that we should take. But, I have to add as well that, since COVID and that's changed an awful lot about how we work. And so, we have a lot of virtual meetings and we even have a lot of hybrid meetings, which are an interesting animal in the sense that, some of us are face-to-face and some of us are attending virtually. And that makes the whole dynamic a lot more difficult. I'm a big advocate of face-to-face meetings because the relationship you build with your colleagues, your competitors, your friends, which ultimately they all become friends because we have a close-knit common mission in life in order to write these standards. So, I have friends all over the world through these standards processes that we work on.
Oh, absolutely. And I should note, you're mentioning you have friends all over the world. I was a hire with AAMI when it was COVID time, so everybody was only collaborating remotely. The first time I got to witness a in-person standards meeting, I was blown away about, basically what a close-knit community this was. Everybody knew each other. They were friends. Everybody's going out for drinks afterwards.
Absolutely.
Laughing. Yeah. This might be, people who are coming from companies that are competitors or an academic talking to a clinician, talking to a regulatory person. This is just absolutely amazing how tight-knit this can become.
Yeah, and you're right to mention that word humor as well, because, we're very focused, we're very professional in what we do, but why shouldn't we enjoy doing it as well? And so humor is something that I personally find very interesting. It keeps the group alive, it keeps it awake. We are more effective as a group if we're all focusing on what our mission is at hand. And so, the odd, humor, wakes everybody up, keeps people engaged, and that's vitally important to the end process.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we were talking about committees on the ISO level, standards on the ISO level. But I should mention, if somebody is coming into this and they want to be part of the standards process, they're going to be starting with possibly a technical advisory group, like a tag, which would then be moving up to ISO. So who is that normally? Is that groups like AAMI, ANSI? What was going on?
Okay, so AAMI is one of the very significant US standards developers.
Yeah.
And so AAMI, as you well know, will be developing standards either for national consumption or will be providing its national input into the international work.
Right.
And so, again, that echoes back to what we were just talking about with the difference between national standards and international standards and the reasons why the two of them exist. But for the most part, what we do at ISO level is then backfed into the US, for example, as an ISO document adopted by AAMI and ANSI, the American National Standards Institute.
Oh, that's interesting. And they're taking input also from advisory groups from all these other countries, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. So typically, a few people will be selected from an AAMI national group to be those participants representing the US position, representing the US and fighting the US corner. The same, I've got a number of hats, of course, as you well know, I'm British, so I do get involved, but both both sides of the Atlantic, if you like, and I have to be very careful how I choose which hat I wear, because of course, if we're developing US national standards, there's no point in me saying, well, in the UK, this is what we want, because that's not really part of the discussion. But when these standards are international, of course, every position is valid, and we listen to all. And we're trying not to draft standards or write standards that are very focused in what one country's practice is. We need to listen to all. And that's why sometimes some of these ISO standards are written at slightly higher level, not getting into too much of the prescription, because that's when it starts becoming different in different parts of the world.
Right, right. And I have noticed sometimes it's like a snake eating its own tail. You know, I'll see an ISO standard be adopted back in the US, and then it gets recognized by the FDA.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
So this sounds all well and good, but some of our viewers might be like, okay, that's great. Why should I get involved, or how can I get involved?
Yeah. Good question. And it can be slightly intimidating at first, because, you know, who are all these people? You know, some of them, like myself, with years and years of experience. But I fully encourage anybody to get involved. Anybody that's got something to give should be, you know, putting themselves forward for two reasons. One, because, of course, on the committee's receiving side, more participants with a wider perspective in life help to contribute to that consensus best practice position ultimately. But the other side of it is that you can learn so much from these debates, from these discussions. A lot of my technical knowledge, I started off as a scientist understanding this, but it's only when you start getting involved with debating with people about these areas that you fully understand the nuances of everything. And so even just reading a standard, you don't always understand some of the major discussions that took place behind the scenes in order to have just a very clear sentence that means something quite clearly. But the background to that is the benefit of actually participating. So anybody that feels they would really like to get involved, it's a fascinating opportunity to meet like-minded people, whoever they may be,
right,
in order to actually reach this consensus that we're all aiming to achieve.
And you mentioned language, and I'm glad you did, because this is a big call to action, especially for our technicians and our boots on the ground, maybe sterile processing department workers. They might be reading a standard and saying, oh, you said this, but you meant it this way, and I actually think of it this way. That's an important perspective we need in these standards discussions, right?
Absolutely. So not only what we're writing, i.e. do this or do that,
right,
but the way that we write it, so that it is clearly unambiguous, so that it is understood by all. And that's why people should get involved. The debates that take place, if you know, halfway through the development of a standard, you'll be submitting written comments, and your written comments are typically written in as eloquent a way as possible, such that the committee can just read it saying that's a well put together comment, accepted, and that will then be, of course, written directly into the standard. If you have a less well thought through comment on a draft standard, it could be that there's an hour or two's discussion just in that area, and that, of course, you know, implies that there isn't clarity there, and we need to have that discussion in order to realize that.
Oh, that's excellent. Well, Richard, I feel like you've pulled back the curtain a little bit. Maybe for some of our viewers, they might be thinking of getting involved in AAMI standards or British standards if they're in the UK. Thank you so much. Is there any final notes that you want to bring up? Maybe a main call to action for anybody here at AAMI Exchange?
Well, again, just repeating what I said a moment ago, anybody that feels they want to get involved, AAMI's website has some great information on all of the committees that exist. Just browse through all of that and see what's your area, what you would like to be involved in, and then reach out to AAMI. There are processes involved in order to get involved in that, but the starting point, the great starting point, I think, is the AAMI website, where there's a great list of all of the standards committees that exist, and whatever is your specialism or particular interest, that's the starting point.
There are so many committees, and anybody who is interested can actually just reach out to standards@aami.org. Somebody there will be able to start answering your questions. Well, thanks again, Richard. This has been really good, and congratulations on being named a fellow. That's a wonderful recognition.
Thank you,
well
Brian.
deserved.
Thank you, Brian. I'm very happy.